All right, good morning, everyone. It's good to see so many of you here at 9 a.m. after the party last night. I was expecting an empty room of just people streaming in later, but that's fine. So I'm James, or Smith, JW, on Twitter and on the Mac Admins Slack channel. I will say, if you're not on the Mac Admins Slack team, go join. It's a great resource. And that fancy QR code will take you to my website where all my slides will be posted. I'll also show it at the end. QR codes are now cool again because iOS 11 supports them natively, which is great. We've all been waiting for that time. So just a bit of a summary of what I'll be going through today. So we're going to be talking about who we are, Culture Amp, where we started in terms of our onboarding, where we are now, and how we got there. And just so that we're all on the same page, when I refer to onboarding, I'm talking about the first day or two, sometimes even a week or two of a new hire's experience in a company. I'll be going into specific details around pre-onboarding, so that's before a new person starts with an organization, how systems are set up before they arrive, and what they're going to experience from an IT perspective. So now just a little about where I work at Culture Amp. So we help you make your company a better place to work, making it really, really easy to collect, understand, and act on employee feedback. By connecting these activities together and making them easy, we enable organizations to build repeatable feedback loops that make continuous learning and improvement possible. As you can imagine, I got that from our marketing team, so they're not my words. So we were founded in Melbourne, Australia, and we've now got offices in also San Francisco, New York, and London. So I wanted to start off today with a bit of a story, just to make this whole thing a bit more relatable, a bit more engaging. This is Johnny Appleseed. He enjoys long walks along the beach, and he's a fan of Apple products. He used to work in a small shared co-working space, just a couple of people. Now he's joining a large global team. He's a little bit nervous. This is a picture from our office in Melbourne. Got a lot of people there. We've got a bit of a weird bunch in San Francisco. This was their Buffy day. This is our New York office and our newly formed London office. Johnny really wants to make a good impression when he joins the company. So now a little about where we started in terms of our onboarding procedure. We started off fairly well. He comes to work, there's a brand new Mac sitting on his desk. I imagine some of you have worked in places where sometimes this doesn't even happen, or someone doesn't even know that you're starting in an organization. It's not great, but at the end of the day, this was kind of the best case scenario. Things are there waiting for them. People know that he's going to turn up. Now, let's see what happens when he goes to set up his machine. So as you're all aware, they're going to open up the box and go through the setup assistant. Try to connect to Wi-Fi. Hopefully they get the right password. Then they're going to be prompted by all of these different options. They're going to possibly sign into iCloud if they're aware of what iCloud is or have an iCloud ID. Prompted by two-factor. Agree to some terms and conditions, fill out some user account details, and then they're going to wait. As you can see, I've sped this up. They're going to keep on waiting for iCloud. It's probably going to take a while. And I should have sped this up even more. I promise it does get there in the end. they're finally going to do some final enablement of settings, and then they're at the desktop. It's not a great experience. It takes a long time. If they've used a Mac before, it would be fairly similar, but if you're in an organisation where you've got people switching from PCs, it may seem a bit overwhelming, a bit confronting. Probably also important to note that when we had the system in place originally, there was no technology team, there was no IT help. New starters would be reliant upon someone else in the office kind of knowing what's going on. All right, let's move on to SaaS services. How many of you have seen this on a desk before someone starts? They'd get a temporary password on a sticky note from their manager. It had probably been generated a little while earlier. And this sticky note would just be sitting on their desk, sometimes a couple of days prior, sometimes a week prior. It's pretty secure, isn't it? Oh, there's meant to be audio in this. He actually speaks. That's all right. So he's saying it's fine, it's all fine, you know. Ah, there we go. We got the end of it, that's all right. All right, next they'd proceed to logging into Gmail and setting up all their services. So this is another video. It's sped up, and it's also aided by the fact that I've actually installed a password manager while I'm doing this, so I'm able to generate these passwords for all the different services. But as you can imagine, a new person might not have a password manager, they might not know about that, so they might be in the case where they're using the same password for every single login. I'm just going to obviously skip ahead because you don't want to watch this because this takes a really long time. It's kind of depressing to think that this is how we used to onboard people. You start and you've got 50 emails in your inbox. It just keeps going and going and going. All right, so we started off with a slow and cumbersome workflow. In a lot of cases, it didn't even get the person up and running on their first day. And this doesn't even account for production access to services within CultureAmp. All right. So, where are we now? How do we improve that IT onboarding experience? Here's a snapshot of what our onboarding experience looks like now. Okay, so we start off with pre-onboarding. So, when a camper joins the company, they're sent an email with a link to a survey. They can then fill this out at home, and this allows them to select equipment preferences for what they'd like to be there on day one. I'm going through asking for their team, I'm giving them options for Macs, and a couple of other certain questions, what sort of keyboard they'd like, what sort of mouse. And finally, I ask some questions about swag, you know, what size t-shirt, and what's their favourite colour. Once it's submitted, it comes through to me, and we're good to go. Now when Johnny arrives, it's a little bit more personal. We've got the Mac that they selected, some accessories, and we've even got a designer who's a fan of calligraphy, so they will write a beautiful little handwritten note with their name on it. If you walk through the CultureAmp offices, you'll actually still see these scattered all around. People leave them on their desk. It's really great for just having that little personal touch. You know where someone's desk is, and if you're still new at the company, you can kind of glance and see, oh, that's who that person, that's what their name is. Next up is account access. So when a camper is now added to our identity provider, their temporary password and a link to a setup guide is added into LastPass. This is shared, or this LastPass note is shared with a number of people across our offices who are responsible for the onboarding process. So generally that is either IT staff, if they're in the office, and experience managers, or what you'd probably refer to as office managers. In this example, we're also using a different type of temporary password. Rather than a random string of letters and numbers, which can often be hard to type, we're using one that is just, it's quite a bit longer, it's more secure, but it's easier to type. Here's a demo of setting up a new password from the user's point of view. So they're going to start on either an iPad that we have in some offices, or the person who's onboarding them their Mac in an incognito browser. They're going to log into Okta. They're then going to set up their 2FA. They're going to grab their phone, unlock it, basically scan the code, and then they're going to be prompted for that temporary password, and now they can set their new password. Once this is done, they'll be at the Okta dashboard, and they're off to the races. It's probably important to note that if you don't currently have an identity provider like Okta now, there are costs involved with not only paying for that service, but also all the other services that you're going to connect to it. Often companies will charge you either a flat fee to add SAML or single sign-on, or force you to upgrade to the enterprise level plans. Now, I'm not saying that this cost should immediately discount it, it's just something to be aware of. In our case, the additional cost of these services is outweighed by the time savings that we're able to gain by being able to set up users in a repeatable and consistent manner. I highly recommend looking into a system like this. All right, now we'll see what the equipment setup looks like. So all our Macs start the same way, but now we're prompted for this DEP workflow. They're going to go ahead and they're going to authenticate with those credentials that they set prior. All the other setup assistant steps have been skipped. And then they're going to set that up and land at the desktop, at which point SplashBuddy, which has been mentioned several times at this conference before, is going to take over. So this is going to display all the applications and policies that I'm running, installing on New Campus Macs. I've also added this nice little web view to show the different, just some information about what I'm actually doing. Once that's finished, they'll be logged out, they log back in, File Vault is enabled, and they're off to the races. It's a much smoother process. From here, I've got a little onboarding policy which the experience manager would take them through. So we've got an onboarding policy which is scoped to them based on how long they've been at the company. That's going to launch Chrome to various websites which are taken through. And they're obviously going to be prompted for to use Chrome as their default. I'm still finding a way to automate that. And they're going to log into the browser. For logging into the browser, it's not the smoothest experience, but that's something that I can't really change, and I'm hoping that Google will improve this. Obviously, because G Suite is connected to Okta, they're redirected to log in here. Once they do that, they'll be pushed, and then we'll see some extensions start to be pushed down. So all of these extensions are managed by Google Apps admin, and I'm forcing those Chrome extensions to be added. So I'm adding Trello, Okta, LastPass, and the Zoom Scheduler app. So we've moved to a much more scalable model for onboarding new campers. It's a consistent, it's repeatable, and it's a more delightful process. Okay, so how do we get from that shitty and manual process to this amazingly simple, some might say magical, process that involves no touching from an IT perspective? And there are two key things that I'll focus on: standardization and automation. I had to find an excuse to include an XKCD comic. In this case, this is an example of bad standards. We don't want these sorts of standards. But what I will say is try and pick some standards early, and I'll show you what I mean. So in the first case, email naming standards. Now, you don't have to stick with one for all time. Just pick one early, and if you want to change down the track, make sure you've got a clear delineation. Now, I'm not joking. Each one of these conventions exists in our employee database as an email convention over the years. First name at domain.com, it only works when you're a young company. When I joined CultureAmp, I was number 10 in the company, so getting James at cultureamp.com was fairly easy. But account provisioning at that stage is owned by not even IT usually. So they're just like, all right, let's just do this. We've now settled on firstname.lastname@cultureamp.com. It's easy to pass, it's easy to read, and you're not likely to run into any issues with too many people having a same first and last name. If it's available and if a new camper requests it, I'll also provision them first at cultureamp.com as an alias. I've got no issue with assigning people aliases, but I do like the standardization that comes of knowing that every single email address that I'm provisioning is firstname.lastname. It makes it really easy to contact people because all you need to know is their name, and then you can figure out what their email address is. We do the same thing with group naming. Now, here's a couple of examples of how you could name your teams. You could just, in our case, we call them teams, in your case, departments. So we could call it Alpha, Alpha Team, or Team Alpha. I've settled on putting a team prefix beforehand rather than a suffix. It makes it a lot easier when you're sorting through lists of services. So when you're looking at all your G Suite groups, being able to have them all with a prefix means that when you sort that group alphabetically, you can see, oh, these are all my departments and these are all my different groups, interest groups or something else. Basically, in every single service, it'll make it a lot easier if you're using a prefix in front of those group names. Along with naming conventions and standards, we should also look at computer standards. This is just the base models that are available on Apple's website. There are a lot here. And if you were to simply say, all right, just go to the website and pick something, that's going to lead to having a whole bunch of different models throughout the org. That's going to mean that it's hard to troubleshoot because it's like, oh, does this model have 16 gigs of RAM or 8 gigs of RAM? If you standardize across certain sets, I'm not saying you should just have one computer for every single person, but if you have a couple of standards, so a base spec and a spec'd up model, it makes it a lot easier to troubleshoot that. If you don't, you'll be providing support for equipment that often doesn't actually support the job that the person is in. And sometimes it will even mean you're paying too much for equipment. An office manager might not necessarily need a 15-inch MacBook Pro with a terabyte hard drive and 16 gigs of RAM. I'm sure there are cases for that, but probably not. That confusion is going to lead to this guy again. We don't want to be back here. So the way that I'm getting around that is part of that onboarding form. I'm guiding a person to select a default. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't select something else, but what it means is 9 times out of 10, since I've put a default selection in, 90% of people just select the default, which is great. It means I'm able to look at our hire planning and forecast out for the next month, I'm going to need this number of low-spec Macs and this number of high-spec Macs. I can then order them across the business. Sure, I might need to put in a custom order here or there, but it makes this process a lot easier. It'll make your life a lot easier as well. All right, the other key thing I'm going to talk about is automation. It's really hard to find stock images. It's like, it's a robot, yeah, it kind of works. All right, so that pre-onboarding process that I showed you, I'm using Typeform. And this is the Typeform interface where you can create you basically drag questions from one side to the other, put them in order, and it'll go through and ask campers these questions. On the left, you can see these little jumps. And what that will do is it's some logic in there to determine if I put this answer in, jump to this question, or jump to that. It's how I can determine that if someone is in a customer team, they're going to get a 13-inch MacBook as a default to select. And if they're an engineer, they're going to select a 15-inch default. And you can make these as complex or as simple as you like. It's a really great platform, and I find it's a lot prettier than something like Google Forms. Next up is Zapier. Now, if you haven't looked at Zapier, it's kind of like IFT. I like to refer to it as the glue for the web. It ties all your different applications together online. So in this case, what I'm using Zapier for is to take the results of that survey. So it's going to grab the typeform entry. It's going to format some of the options. So it will take all of those results, and then I can do markup, lookup, replace things. It's going to search for a Trello card on our board, which is how we manage new hires in the company. So once they're added, they're going to show up as a little card in our Trello onboarding board. This is going to search for that particular card, looking for their first and last name. It's going to create a comment based on those answers, putting in what the team they're in, the Mac that they've selected, whether they want an iPhone, if that's an option that's been shown to them. It asks, have they used a Mac before? I gather that information so that if we've got some PC converts, I'm able to organise them going to some kind of beginner Mac classes or Mac switching classes. It'll help ease their onboarding experience. And some other things, the t-shirt and the favourite colour. The t-shirt size is important because all of our experience managers also have access to this Trello board so that when someone new starts, they'll actually have a t-shirt on their desk provided in the correct size. I also then label that card with an appropriate label saying that we've received an equipment request. I move it to a different list. I'm then going to send a channel message to Slack, which is going to notify the technology team. And I'll also set myself a reminder to check to make sure that we've got the appropriate stock, just in case they've selected a non-standard model. In Trello, that's what this card is going to look like, and that's what that comment's going to come up as. And in Slack, our friendly IT guy is going to remind us to go check the board to make sure that we've got all the equipment that they've requested. All right, account access. So in that Trello card, in that LastPass note that I showed you earlier, was a link to our onboarding document. In here, we've got instructions for the team lead or the experience manager who's running it and how to proceed. In an office where we've got some onboarding iPads, they'll use that iPad and give that to the new hire as what to enter their credentials. And if they don't, they'll use that experience manager's Mac and open up an incognito window to set that password. We've got some more instructions for the camper, just around the type of password that they need. Now, one important thing to note is, in order to set up the Mac, they need to have set their Okta password. But in order to set up their Okta password, they need to have set up their Mac. It's kind of this loop. It's not great, which is why I've got those instructions to either use an iPad to do it or to use their Mac. So we're using Okta as our identity provider, but there are a number of different services out there. And the way that the information flows to automate this whole process is once I get a card in Trello saying we've got a new person starting, that's kind of a manual breakpoint. From there, I'll go into Active Directory and I will create their user account with that temporary password. From there, I then run a sync in Okta, which will import all those details. I'll do a final check to make sure that their email, title, and name is all correct. And then once I approve it, Okta will then go and automatically create accounts across a number of services. It's going to create their G Suite account, it's going to create their Slack account, it's going to create their Trello account. We've got many, many services in here, and they all happen automatically. We still have a number of services which either don't support SAML or they're not used enough to justify the cost. And in those cases, I'm still setting those up manually. And as you can imagine, once you come from a nice automated system and then you still have to set up things manually, it's a bit frustrating. So in Okta, here's a bunch of team groups. Now, Okta's got this great feature called push groups, What will happen is when a person is assigned to a specific team, it's going to then push that team or department through to the end application as a group. So in the case of adding them to the Team Agro group in Active Directory, it's then going to add them to that appropriate group in G Suite, which is going to be an email distribution list for that team. The same thing for Slack. We're going to push people through into groups. It's a really great feature from Okta. And on the Slack side of things, just as an example, when you push users through into a particular group, it will create a group. From there, in the Slack side of things, you can actually set a handle and you can set some default channels. This makes the onboarding experience so much smoother because you're not just starting in the Slack team, which could have hundreds of channels. In our case, we've got about 600 channels. It's quite a lot of Slack channels. And it kind of guides the person to, here are some relevant channels for your interests. So in this case, we do a bunch of channels based on their location, based on the group that they're in within the company, and also down to the team level, so specific team channels. All right, finally, I'll talk about the equipment setup. That's probably what you're all here waiting to see. I thought I'd throw in some other information prior. So, we're using Jamf, obviously. So Zapier is the glue for the web. Jamf is the glue that, for my Mac setup, it holds everything together. We're heavily leveraging DEP. If you're not using DEP now, I would highly recommend signing up for it. Even if you don't utilize DEP, start purchasing Macs as part of your customer number. This will enable you to enroll those Macs via DEP at a later point in time. You don't have to use it straight away, but get your Macs in there early. In the case of DEP, this means that you're going to be ordering Macs directly from Apple or an authorized reseller. And once those Macs then arrive at your office, they're going to be associated with your particular customer number. And this means that configuration will happen automatically as soon as that Mac connects to Wi-Fi. So this is a screenshot of Jamf where we've got all of the Macs that come in. So this is the DEP page where basically every single Mac and iOS device will be listed. So we've got Macs flowing into Jamf from our DEP accounts in Australia, the US, and the UK. It's important to note you can have multiple customer numbers and they can all route into the same place. I've also got several pre-stage enrollments. Depending on what's going to happen. We've got a default pre-stage, we've got an existing devices pre-stage, and that's more relevant for if you've already got user accounts on a Mac. I set that to not create a user account, just because there's already one there. And we've got one for Office Macs. This will mean that I can ship a Mac Mini to a new office, and when they're assigned to that group, it will automatically set them up as a conference room Mac as soon as they're connected into Ethernet. So to drill a bit deeper into the default pre-stage enrollment, so all devices are automatically assigned to this pre-stage. I'm also marking it as requiring authentication. So if you noticed here, I put a little note in there to say, log in using your Okta credentials. Now, at the end of the day, this is actually LDAP credentials for Active Directory, but the end user doesn't know that. They just see that they've logged into Okta, and now I'm asking them to use that same password and username that they've used to now log into their Macs. It makes it a bit easier to get the handle of things. From here, I'm skipping all the setup steps other than location. I leave location there not as a tracking mechanism, because that's not what it's there for, but to set the time, because otherwise, if users don't select that, all their Macs are going to be set to Cupertino time until they set it manually. And then from there, we see all the Macs that are assigned to this pre-stage. I try to make this setup experience as simple as possible. It's important to, it's an overwhelming feeling starting at a new company, and you want to make that process as easy for a new person as possible. So to make this setup more slick, I'm using Splash Buddy. So this is a video running at normal speed. What I do here in this web view is just scroll through a bunch of information that I want to give the new hire. Now, if you like. I've got my setup for all of this on my GitHub page, and you can get there through my blog. I'll show that QR code at the end. We can get some more information. If you're not aware, Splash Buddy is a tool made by Francois. We had or FTIF on the Slack channel. Great guy. He's actually presenting here at 11 o'clock or 11:15, and we had a Splash Buddy jumpstart last night. So it's an application that's designed to be shown above the desktop, basically stopping users from using their computer until the setup is done. Splash Buddy doesn't actually execute anything. All it's doing is watching the Jamf log for specific packages to be installed. And once they are, these little dots are going to go green. Just a way of showing what's happening to the user, what's being installed. I'm trying to be very transparent and very open with what they're talking about, with what they're seeing as part of the setup. Once it's all done, Splash Buddy will quit, and then they'll be restarted. So I'll show you how we do that. So I've got one policy in Jamf that runs on enrollment complete, and that's the one to install Splash Buddy. So here you can see that we've got it enabled, it's enrollment complete, and it's also got a custom one for when I'm checking. So what I do is I package up Splash Buddy, and that is deployed to the Mac. It's got some various checks in there to determine if the user is at the desktop and logged in, and once that occurs, Splash Buddy will show up. Depending on DEP, on the time of day, when a user hits the desktop after the setup assistant, it can take anywhere from 5 seconds to 30 seconds to a minute. It really depends on how DEP is feeling that day, and if it just decided, I'm not going to get out of bed this morning. And the final thing that I do is execute a script. Now, I'm executing a script to run all of these custom policies that I'm installing, rather than packaging them up into Splash Buddy. This means that if I want to add something extra into the enrollment process, I just need to update that script in Jamf. I don't need to repackage Splash Buddy. So this is my enrollment script, and this is what happens. So we start off by caffeinating the Mac. We're then going to go through and we're going to install each of these policies. So in this case, we're going to install Zoom. We're going to install some assets on their computer. If you notice during the setup, I set the background. It's one of the things that's put down. We're going to install Slack, docutil, that's how I format the doc, and a bunch of other policies. Following that, we're going to create a done file. That's important to make sure that if Splash Buddy is still on the Mac, it won't launch again. One of the launch checks is this done file there? If it isn't there, Splash Buddy will continue to launch every 10 seconds, and that's determined by the launch daemon. If it is there, it's not going to launch. Following that, I'm going to update the inventory. In my case, this is important because I actually have an EA which looks for that done file. When Jamf sees that the Mac has, that done file is there as part of the EA, it adds it to an enrollment complete group. Once that computer is part of that enrollment complete group, a couple of follow-on policies execute, one of which is our Wi-Fi config profile. Because of some issues with Jamf at the moment, if the computer actually changes networks during enrollment complete stops and doesn't actually continue afterwards. So then you're stuck with a computer that's meant to set up itself, but it doesn't. I understand that Jamf is actually working on this, and I think it will be resolved very soon, but this is a little workaround. I sense some people have run into this before. It was a really fun one to determine why this stuff wasn't executing. Finally, I'm then going to quit Splash Buddy. I'm going to remove the launch daemon and unload it. I'm going to delete it. I'm going to uncaffeinate. And then I'm going to force the user to log out. One of the policies that I execute is to enable file vault at next login. So to force that, I'm not shutting down, I'm just using this little line here to log the user out. Once they log in, they're presented with this little pop-up box that says, your administrator wants you to enable file vault, click enable or click cancel. If they click cancel, they sit at the login window. They can't log in until they've enabled file vault. So if they don't want it, that's fine, but they'd be working on a brick. So, what did we talk about today? We talked about standards. They're very important. It helps. It's kind of the foundation that everything else that I do is based upon. We talked about pre-onboarding to smooth that experience and that transition into a new job. We talked about account access and provisioning, and then finally, the equipment setup. Thank you. As I said, open up your camera app. You might have to zoom it in so it fills the screen, but then you will get to my blog where I will have all of the videos and this presentation. Also got links to me on Slack, Twitter, and also GitHub. If you've got any questions, we've got a couple of mics, and yeah.
Awesome, thank you so much. If anyone has a question, if you wouldn't mind hopping up, there's a mic right behind you, just so that everyone can hear.
Can I just say it's amazing to see a room full of you trying to capture this QR code. We've all been waiting for QR codes to be cool again. Thank you, iOS 11.
Oh, here we have one question here.
Yes. How you doing? Thank you so much. That was great.
That's all right.
I missed this part. I know you probably mentioned it, but in Jamf, do you have multiple pre-stages that kind of each have their own department and building or whatever? Is that how you do?
No. So because I am basically assigning, because I have people authenticate with Jamf as part of that enrollment process, all of that location information and where that person starts is actually coming from AD. So by the time that the computer is enrolled in Jamf and it shows up, it actually has their name, their email address, the team that they're in, and also the location. So then I'm seeing all that location information in Jamf because I've asked them for authentication.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
That's all right.
We have another question over here.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hey, so we are a largely growing startup using the G Suite. Did you transition from using Hangouts, if you used it, to Slack? Or did you ever use Hangouts?
So we have never used Hangouts for chat. We used to use it briefly for video chat, and we had a whole bunch of different services until I moved us and settled us on Zoom. We had a big kind of talk about all the different video platforms that are out there and which one we wanted to use. We're very happy with Zoom. But in the case of Slack, we actually transitioned from HipChat. So when I joined, we were using HipChat. I'm like, let's use Slack, it's better. And there was a lot of discussion, and we trialed it, and then we never went back. So,
Cool.
Sorry.
No, you're
yeah,
good.
I have a next tip.
I was hoping you had the magical grail to sell someone on how we can move from Hangouts to Slack.
Reacties, emojis. You can add in some really great Slackbot responses. We've got ones that will do every time someone says flip, Slack will respond by flipping a table. That's kind of got to be a selling point right there.
Thank you.
That's all right.
So I saw in your setup script that you use a policy to call an inventory update.
Yep.
And I was curious what that does that Recon doesn't do.
Oh, so that's what it does. All it is just, I could really just do Jamf Recon, but in this case, I just set it up as just a policy. Just, I like to have things neat, and just so I like the call.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's all right.
Maybe a bit left field, but sometimes name changes can be a bit like an onboarding.
Yes.
I'm curious, kind of culturally, how you do that, walk people through stuff. And
so a name change is a very manual process. Sometimes a name change will happen before a person starts. So in our case, we will hire someone and that name will come in as their full legal name. And often they don't go by that legal name. They'll have a shorter name that they like to use. So in that case, if I haven't been notified beforehand, I will have created this, their AD account with their full legal name and this really long email address. So in that case, what I then have to do is I've got two options. I either basically just delete all of their accounts and start fresh because they haven't logged in, or I will change those details in AD, sync them to Okta, and go through each of the services and make sure that their email address is kind of mapped to the new one. So I haven't found kind of a really good automated way to go through that. You're pretty much going to have to go through and change each of your services if the primary email address is changing.
thanks.
That's all right.
Hello.
Morning.
Everybody's talking about Zero Touch and DEP and Splash Buddy, and it's awesome. We are an established company without a lot of onboarding. So the hardware that gets deployed is more replacing existing machines.
Yep.
Are you doing anything about that at CultureAmp? And because, you know, in terms of like data migration or settings that come over or anything, you know, it's a harder animal in a way.
Yeah, so in the case of recycling machines, we'll generally do that. Older machines will get recycled as temporary machines if someone's Mac is in the shop. In those cases, what we'll do is if their machine is there and still functioning, we'll just do a direct clone across. If not, we'll just run them through that setup experience, and then we have a pretty strong mandate that all of our important documents are stored in our various cloud providers, so that they've always got access to them if they fail. One thing, when we've got a person going from an older Mac to a newer Mac, there's a couple of gotchas in terms of doing a direct clone. I don't like to use the migration assistant. I prefer to do a direct clone, but in that case, it's really important to, in the case of DEP, the configuration, it's non-removable from the Mac. There are a couple of commands you can run to actually blow it away, but it's kind of nuking it from orbit. So in that case, what I'll do is I'll go into the Jamf interface, I'll remove that computer from MDM, which pulls everything, the MDM side of things off the Mac. I'll then clone it and re-enroll that Mac so that it gets the appropriate settings and it's not, it doesn't have a broken installation.
Thank you.
That's all right.
We've got time for 2 more questions here.
I know we focus a lot on onboarding, and then there's that flip side when people leave.
Yep.
And the offboarding. How delightful is that for IT?
I'm working on that.
Because I figured next
Yes.
year might be.
Yes, so our onboarding is delightful, our offboarding, it's still a manual process and we're still working on that. In the case of Okta, if the end services support deprovisioning, that's great. Those services will get revoked. At the end of the day, they can't, even if those services still exist with their account, they can't log into them because Okta has been disabled, but we still need to manually go in and remove those services so that we're not using up additional seat counts. Other than that, we use our own platform. We've got onboard and exit surveys. So just after someone joins the company, they will probably about 6 weeks later, they have an onboarding survey about their experience. Before they leave the company, we'll actually do an exit survey to see the reasons behind why they left. Was it because they just got a better offer, they weren't satisfied, or what have you? So we are actively trying to improve our offboarding process.
Yeah, that'd be great to see next year.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's all right.
So in your pre-onboarding process, what happens when a user clicks on B instead of the default A MacBook Pro 15-inch?
So what will happen there is it'll actually pop up and show, if you'd like something custom, email james@cultureamp.com and I discuss it with them. They can also just write in some text there, and if it's kind of something, so if it's as simple as going, an engineer who we specify gets a 15-inch laptop, if they want a 13-inch, that's fine. It just means that I have to order a custom 13-inch, absolutely maxed out. Conversely, if it's someone in, let's say, finance, who by default would get a 13-inch, and they want a 15, that's fine. I just get the base model 15 for them. If they ask for a PC, I just
Right
pretty
on,
much
man.
say, not at the moment. If you really need it, you can have a VM. So we don't support PCs at the moment.
Cool, thank you.
That's all right.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our speaker.
Thank you.